Welcome to another Boats Law live on TikTok that I'll be posting here where you're viewing it on YouTube. And today, talking about why and how boys, men, and dads have been abandoned by U.S. social policy and what it means. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's get this show on the road. Kick off. Good morning. Thank you for joining me, Scott Boats again. Why and how boys, men, and dads have been abandoned by U.S. social policy and what it means. So, last week I talked about why men must unite to restore balance in American culture. Today, I want to show you something more specific. I want to give you some receipts, the data behind America's invisible crisis. First, men are not failing. Men are leaving marriage, leaving college, leaving the workforce, leaving the doctor's office. Preventive care visits are down dramatically in a generation, leaving therapy. And the mental health professions, again, are 80% female, but men are abandoning therapy. Not broken, just leaving, just done. And nobody in Washington is asking why. But it does matter. Here's what I've learned after 30 years practicing law. You can't shame someone into agreeing with you or shame someone into participating with you. Not on juries and not in politics or anywhere else in life. Likewise, you can't replace someone who's already checked out, who's already gone. Today, I'm going to walk you through why boys, men, and dads have been abandoned by U.S. social policy, how this abandonment has happened systematically over decades, and what it means for families, for our sons, and for the future of American culture. This is not about rage, and it's not really about culture war either. It is about arithmetic. So let's get into it. Let's look at the policy infrastructure gap that has contributed to the abandonment. Let's look at the abandonment in numbers, in other words. This number still shocks me. Seven, that's the number of federal bureaucracies all dedicated to women's health. They're located in the HHS, NIH, FDA, CDC, AHRQ, HRSA, SAMHSA. Women's health is important. I agree. But how many federal offices are dedicated to the health and the success of boys and men? None. Zero. Never. Now, here's what makes that stunning to me. Men die 5 years earlier than women. Men commit suicide at nearly 5 times the rate of women. Men account for the vast majority of deaths by despair. That is, the slow death through withdrawal, isolation, drugs, and alcohol. And yet, zero federal offices studying why. Zero federal programs addressing it. Zero political will to name the problem. Since 2000, 15 different bills have been introduced in Congress to create a single Office of Men's Health, but none has ever received a floor vote. Not one. 15 different bills, zero votes. That's not neglect, that's just official policy. Let's look at the education abandonment of boys and men. It all starts in school. By age 5, boys are already 16 percentage points less likely than girls to be school ready. That's the starting point. By high school, 7 out of 10 valedictorians are girls. 45% more girls than boys graduate each year. Boys make up 67% of the lowest GPAs and only 34% of the highest GPAs. By college, there are 2.4 million more women on American campuses. Men account for only 42% of bachelor's degree, and that's the lowest share ever recorded. And it keeps going down too, by the way. For every man who graduates college, we can expect two female graduates within any 5-year period. And before anyone says, well, girls are just smarter than boys. No, no, that is unequivocally false. A 2022 meta-analysis over 15,000 participants found no statistically significant difference for being female as opposed to being male, or being a girl rather than being a boy when measuring IQ. When you control for everything, there is no explanation for why men are unrepresented on college campuses or with, frankly, high school degrees, or in law schools, or frankly, in the white collar workforce, except the people who are teaching in elementary school. Well, that's 89% female. In above that, it gets to be 80% female. In law schools, it's 50% female. That's problematic. That seems to be the statistic that is most telling. There is no IQ difference between boys and girls, none. But boys are underperforming because the system doesn't know them and doesn't seek to know them or to teach them. The academic gap is never about ability, it's about environment. We just don't educate boys, we fail boys. Here's a statistic that should alarm every parent. 47% of young women ages 25 to 34 now hold a bachelor's degree. Only 37% of young men do. That's a 10-point gap, and it's growing, of course. Among Black Americans, the gap is even wider. 38% of Black women have degrees. Only 26% of Black men do. That's a 12-point gap along racial and gender lines. And neither major party's platform is mentioning it. Now, the special education and discipline pipeline in schools. Boys are 72% of children with special education needs. Boys are twice as likely to be suspended for the very same infraction as a girl. Boys comprise 72% of all school suspensions and expulsions. And remember, this is in an environment where about 80% of the employees, the teachers, are female. These boys are getting kicked out, suspended, denied an education. So we suspend the boys in school. And then when they become adults and they face a judicial system that is over 50% female, a legal profession that it very quickly will be 60% female. Well, we put those young men into jail. We suspend them in school and imprison them as adults. Men receive sentences 29% longer than women for the identical crime. That is not an anecdote. That's from the United States Sentencing Commission. Let's talk about employment abandonment for men in the workplace. There are 700,000 fewer prime-age men employed or seeking work compared to 2004. In 2024, 2 years ago, 260,000 more young men than women were classified as NEET. That means not in employment or education or training. The share of young men not in school or the labor force has doubled since 1990, from 4% to 8%. Among millennial men, that is, at age 25, 14% are not in the labor force. For the baby boomers, a while back, at that same age, well, only half that number were not in the labor force. Again, we're failing the boys. And when they become men, we're failing the men. Since 1979, most men's real wages have fallen. Most women's real wages have risen. That's not a complaint. Again, that's from the Federal Reserve. Now, the fatherlessness crisis. Let's talk about what happens when we abandon dads and ignore the rights of dads. 18.4 million children in the United States live without a father in the home. That's roughly 1 in 4 American children. Here's what the research tells us about the presence of a father. Men raised with their biological father are 2.5 times more likely to graduate college, and they're nearly twice as likely to be employed or in school by their mid-20s. And they're only about half as likely to be incarcerated. But we never see political platforms that focus on the importance of keeping dads involved in the lives of their children. In the few neighborhoods where poor black boys eventually did well economically, one factor stood out. Many had fathers in their home. That's not ideology. That's Harvard economist Raj Shetty's data. Yet family courts continue to treat fathers as visitors rather than parents. Fathers receive primary custody only about 7% of the time in contested cases. The average father receives only 35% of total custody time with their child. Only 12.8% of cases result in shared physical custody. So when we have mountains of evidence that father involvement is essential, not merely beneficial to the child and to the culture, our system nonetheless treats fatherhood as optional. For the most part, state bar associations, lawyers, and judges are silent in the face of the problem and very much complicit in perpetuating the problem. Part three, how did we get here? Well, let's look at the infrastructure that's built to assure abandonment of men, boys and men in our culture. It didn't happen by accident. It happened through policy choices. Consider the Biden administration's White House Gender Policy Council. The executive order creating it used the word gender in the title. But here's what it actually said: regular references to women and girls, not a single mention of men or boys anywhere in the 2,000 word document. That council was dissolved in January of 2025. There's been no replacement proposed to address male disparities. Now, let's look at the legislative void. What does exist for boys and men at the federal level? Well, there's the Dads Matter Act of 2024, bipartisan, sponsored by Senator Warnock of Georgia and Senator Rubio of Florida back in 24. Sounds promising, but it's focused on maternal health outcomes. Dads Matter Act of 2024, it's focused on maternal health outcomes. Again, we've got the other seven. Now, eight? What is this? This is not male educational or employment focused. It doesn't talk about the disparities. Let's talk, well, maybe there's House Resolution 487, a resolution expressing that fatherhood is essential. But it was non-binding, no funding whatsoever, no substantial legislation at all came from it. The United States Commission on Social Status of Black Men and Boys had limited scope and limited funding. You know what it addressed? It addresses racial disparity, not gender disparity broadly. Racial disparity means it's focused on women again. Do you understand? No gender disparity, okay? No. It's not about black men and black boys. It's about women again. Neither major party's platform includes programs specifically addressing male education or employment disparities. Democrats focus on women's issues. Republicans focus on cultural issues. Neither focuses on boys falling behind in school at every level. Now, let's look at the legal framework for abandonment of boys, men, and dads in our culture. Look, I agree. We made necessary reforms for women over the past century. The 19th Amendment, voting rights for women. Title VII, equal employment for women. Title IX, equal educational opportunity for women. All necessary changes. But the pendulum, it never stopped at balance. It just kept swinging. So we eventually face the zero-sum reality. Here's what people will never talk about. All resources are finite. Every dollar spent has an opportunity cost. Every program created means that some other program didn't get created. When cuts happen, the question becomes who has legal and political protection and who doesn't. So let's talk about Title IX. Title IX, again, I think this is the third time I've said this. It was necessary. Okay, let's get that out of the way. It was necessary. It created opportunities for women in education and athletics. Yay, good. My point is that we need opportunities now for boys and men. Here's what happened to men's programs over the 50 years since Title IX passed. 171 men's wrestling teams eliminated, 84 men's tennis teams eliminated, 56 men's gymnastics teams eliminated. There are now only 17 men's gymnastics programs remaining in the entire country. Eight men's sports have fewer Division One teams in 2020 than in 1990, despite 58 new Division One schools opening up. Between 1990 and 2020, women's D1 teams grew 60%. Men's teams decreased overall. But the deeper issue is not Title IX itself. The issue is asymmetric protection. When women's programs are cut, they get reinstated through litigation. An army of lawyers, an army of loud advocacy groups. There is no legal infrastructure for men. Men's programs get cut, and no one comes to the rescue. Remember, it's the same pattern repeating everywhere, though. Remember health policy, seven federal bureaucracies for women's health, none for boys and, uh, and men. In criminal justice, women receive 63% shorter sentences for identical crimes. Men receive no equal protection in sentencing. In education, Title IX enforcement infrastructure protects female participation, zero legal protection for male educational outcomes. Is it really a wonder why most people in college are female, not male, or in law school, female, not male? It's because we are ignoring and we are putting aside the interests of boys, men, and dads. And that takes us indeed to family law. Women gained equal property rights. Men lost any presumption of parental importance, and men have gained nothing in return. The pattern you see, it never changes. When women lose something, there's a legal remedy. There's a lot of fuss. When men lose something, there's silence. That's not equality. That is asymmetric vulnerability for boys, men, and dads. It's no wonder that boys continue to fall behind. It's no wonder that men are leaving the culture. It's no wonder that dads are in open revolt, as they should be, with an out of touch family law bar association and the bureaucrats who sit with black robes at the front of the room. Worse, there's a cultural dismissal problem. Toxic masculinity has become the dominant framework. Masculine traits are pathologized, not channeled. The bumbling dad trope dominates advertising and entertainment. The future is female. That slogan is everywhere. Imagine the reaction to the future is male. Or here's another slogan: being a mean girl doesn't make you a strong woman. That's a good slogan, I think. Regardless, when boys struggle in school, we diagnose them. 72% of all school suspensions are boys. Two-thirds of special education students are boys. The youngest boys in any class are 80% more likely to be prescribed ADHD medication. So you see, all those female teachers and mental health professionals, they're diagnosing immaturity in a boy as being a disorder and medicating him, medicating boys for behaving like boys. That's part of the disaster of the mental health professions. Remember, 80% of mental health professionals are now women. Almost 80% of teachers, as we've talked about, are women. 89% of the elementary school teachers are women. Is it really rational to continue to wonder why men don't seek help from that mental health system, or why boys don't engage in learning in that education system, or why fathers withdraw against that family law industrial complex. The last path for how we got here, and that is the death of authenticity. Nobody ever talks about this, but men are just rational. We're less emotional. Rational people stop participating in systems that lie to them constantly. We're told that there's a war on women. Meanwhile, women earn 60% of all the bachelor's degrees, live 5 years longer than men. They're the majority of voters, the majority of college students, the majority of college graduates and graduate students, majority of law students. So they are, or they'll soon be, the majority of family lawyers. So where exactly is this war on women? We're told also, speaking of the death of authenticity, that fringe interests are losing fundamental rights. Meanwhile, 18.4 million children grow up without dads, and nobody calls that a crisis. Boys fall behind girls in reading by a full grade level. Men's suicide rate is 5 times the female rate, and there's no national conversation. Fathers receive primary custody 7% of the time, and we call that best interest of the child? How so, Your Honor? Men are not a fringe. We're half the population. This is the death of authenticity in American culture. The gap between what we're told matters and what we know instinctively harms people. It's become unbridgeable. The courts, the public discourse, and oh my God, the media, hopelessly fake, completely illegitimate. Of course, rational men, all rational people notice this. When a boy struggles in school, we medicate him. When man loses a job to automation, we tell him to learn to code. When a father loses custody of his children, we tell him the system is fair. When he objects, we call him toxic and we give him supervised access. Rational men don't fight systems that refuse to see them. They leave, not in anger, but in clarity and for the defense of clarity. The masculine response to a lying culture is not to scream louder, it's to withdraw our investment. It's to withdraw our effort. Why marry when rules are rigged? We lose the property, we lose the kids, and then we tell the story to the media and the lawyers and the judges who are all clueless and agree nonetheless that men are the problem. Why pursue education when the entire system is designed for someone else? Why seek help when the therapist, she has already diagnosed you before you speak? Look, this is pattern recognition. It's what rational people do. Men, it's hardwired into us to recognize patterns. The math for our culture doesn't work. Whether you're on the left or you're on the right or you're a liberal, or you're conservative, you're a progressive, whatever nonsensical label you attach to yourself, it is all bullshit. So here's the hard truth: the political class and the judicial caste won't doesn't want you to hear. You can't gaslight half the population. You can't tell men their struggles don't exist while building entire bureaucracies around movements for everyone else's petty fringe struggle. You can't tell fathers they have no reproductive rights while framing parenthood as being a women's issue. It takes two to tango. Can't make the cake without the batter. Okay, you can't call masculinity toxic and then wonder why men stop showing up. The death of authenticity in the culture produces the death of participation. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Men aren't failing. They're just making a rational choice to stop investing in institutions that have abandoned them. Somebody else can be the smartest people in the room. You got it. Take it. But men are still, nonetheless, apparently, the only ones who can actually reason, which leads us to what all this means. What does it mean when half the population, the half that builds, provides, protects, and fathers decides that the math doesn't work anymore, well, that's what we need to talk about next, and that is what all this means. First, this is the retreat of the masculine principle. Here's something, please hear me out because this is central to my mission in everything that I do. This really isn't about men leaving. It is about the masculine principle retreating and disappearing from American civic life. That distinguish matters to all of us. Remember, when I talk about masculine and feminine principles or energies, I'm talking about the expression of human energy that we all have. It's not based on gender or sex or sexuality. Think about Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Both were men, but Lincoln advocated confrontation of slavery, not compromise. Again, both men, but Lincoln expressed the masculine principle and Douglas expressed the feminine principle. Carl Jung calls all this the animus. But you don't need to be a Jungian psychologist to understand this. It's as old as time. Jesus knew the price he'd pay by what? Refusing to accommodate. Pilate knew the truth, but he sought consensus with the mob. The masculine principle is the archetypal energy of confrontation over consensus, hierarchy based on competence, not mere group identity, principled contest, that is, the willingness to fight for what is right, even when it's uncomfortable and the odds are stacked against us, individual responsibility over collective accommodation. Last, it's the logos, logic, discernment, clarity. So when men completely withdraw from schools, courts, hospitals, and civic institutions, they remove this archetypal energy from the civic architecture. What does that mean for the rest of us? Well, it's the tyranny or the dominance of the feminine principle. The feminine principle is equally powerful. It handles conflict, however, very differently. This isn't, by the way, about anybody being superior or inferior. It's about natural differences. It's about women and men expressing inherently unique and different energies. It's about archetypal modes of social organization. The feminine principle orients toward consensus over confrontation, harmony over hierarchy, relationship preservation, that is, avoiding conflict to maintain connection, collective well-being over individual accountability, and frankly, eros, that is, connection, empathy, inclusion. In cultures where the feminine principle dominates conflict resolution, research shows this: a preference for avoiding direct confrontation, a preference for dialogue and understanding over assertive contest. That sounds civilized, but here is the problem. Some conflicts cannot be resolved through consensus. Some principles must be fought for. Take, for example, the dispute over the First Amendment. What happens to the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States under feminine dominance? Let me make this concrete because it does deeply matter to me. The text of the First Amendment, it will never change, but its meaning will be inverted through judges, appellate judge, federal trial judges, trial judges, federal trial judges, appellate judges everywhere, and eventually the Supreme Court, whether it's packed or just changes naturally with graduates from feminized law schools dominated by feminized legal professors. All right, so what happens? The text doesn't change, its meaning inverts. Under the masculine principle, the First Amendment should protect principled contests. That is, speech is how we fight for truth in this culture historically. Bad speech, historically, was answered with more speech. That is, confrontation, rebuttal, the clash of ideas. Remember, Lincoln versus Douglas. The individual speaker was protected. Lincoln lost that race, all right? That was a race for the Senate. Lincoln loses. He's still protected, all right, under the masculine principle. He was protected from the collectivist mob. including government, by the way, Mayor Mamdani, because the truth always emerges from adversarial engagement. What about the listener's discomfort? Who cares? It's irrelevant. With the masculine principle, the search for truth triumphs over a preoccupation with feelings. Historically, that was the price of freedom. That's how Lincoln triumphed over Douglas. Your right to speak doesn't depend upon whether the local mob or village wants to hear it. So now watch what happens when the feminine principle dominates. Speech becomes a form of relationship, and words that damage group harmony, the collective peace, if you will, well, those words that cause stress within the collective, they get labeled harmful by the courts. Not metaphorical harm, but actual harm. It's happening everywhere, particularly at the federal level. Actual harm requiring a remedy, requiring intervention. The function of speech regulation shifts under the dominion of the feminine principle. And by the way, those are male judges doing that, all right? Enacting the feminine principle at the federal level as judges. At any rate, the function of speech regulation shifts under the dominion of the feminine principle, from protecting the speaker, Mr. Lincoln, to protecting the feelings of the collectivist and the collective from disruption. Under this framework, everything changes. Hate speech becomes a real category. Not because words are false, oh no, just because they disturb feelings within the collective. Safe spaces become constitutionally significant, zones where confrontational speech is excluded, because harmony, or if you will, everyone just sit down and shut up. That's the prerequisite for participation. Silence is violence. That makes logical sense suddenly. If the collective requires continuing affirmation, then your failure to affirm is itself a disruption. Speech as violence becomes coherent if harm is measured by collective distress, not by physical injury. Then words that cause distress within an individual are violent, regardless of the personal psychosis, their family of origin issues, what it is that makes them a weirdo, or their own ill motives. None of that matters suddenly if they're offended. At any rate, the First Amendment doesn't change on paper. When men withdraw from the culture, the application of the First Amendment inverts. It stops protecting the disruptive individual. It stops protecting Mr. Lincoln against the offended collective, the slaveholders. True creativity dies. Advancement in human culture also dies. Instead, the First Amendment starts protecting the harmonious collective, the idiocracy, against the disruptive individual. And if you think that this is theoretical, my friend, you're not paying attention. This is already the operational framework in universities with Title IX proceedings, where the accused has no right to confront his accuser. In corporate DEI policies, where dissent from imposed orthodoxy is seen as creating a hostile environment. In social media enforcement, where harm means the collective felt uncomfortable, I cannot repost my TikTok videos that talk about kids needing their dad. That's how bad it's getting. At any rate, increasingly through judicial reasoning, oh my God, about what constitutes a hostile workplace. The Bill of Rights, which was written to protect individuals, and it was written to protect individuals from the collective, from the government, in other words. It all changes because of collective madness. When men leave in an increasingly fake culture, the masculine principle retreats. The protections of the Bill of Rights increasingly disappear, but really it's all of law. All of law becomes tools for the collective to manage the disruptive among us. And the individuals who insist on principled confrontation, well, he's the problem. He's toxic. He's causing harm, causing disruption. He needs to be excluded for the health of the collective. Think what's happening in Britain right now with imprisonment for individuals for mere social media postings. The withdrawal of men represents a civilizational shift. It's not a change in the text of rights. It's a change in who those rights protect and from whom. The social contract has been broken, in other words, or at least it's been rewritten and reversed. The individual is not protected anymore. It's the collective that's protective. The collective, however, answers to nobody. Thus, the historic American model for addressing civil conflict is lost when men withdraw from the collective, from the culture. America was founded on something unusual, not tribal identity, not ethnic solidarity, not collectivist traditions. America was founded on the idea of individual liberty. The Declaration of Independence doesn't assert collective rights based on ancestry, race, or religion. It asserts that each person, regardless of our origin, possesses inalienable rights, each person, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The exertion of the masculine principle has delivered those promises to everyone. The abolition movement, remember Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, 600,000 dead to resolve what compromise, the feminine principle, could not resolve? Women's suffrage, again, that's the masculine principle at work. 70 years of principled refusal, the masculine principle at work to accept half citizenship. The labor movement, workers asserting they are persons, not production units. The civil rights movement demanding what the Declaration had already promised, the masculine principle. The disability rights movement, participation as a right, not as an act of charity. None of these were achieved through consensus. The comfort of the collective was never a primary concern. None were negotiated into existence. Each required confrontation, the masculine principle, the insistence that a principle, once recognized, must be delivered in full, not in part, not when the collective is ready for it, but in full. That's the masculine principle, and that is the architecture of the masculine principle. It requires confrontation with tyranny, something men have always done best. It requires hierarchy based upon merit, not birth. It requires principled contest in courts, in legislatures, and public squares. It requires individual accountability before the law. The Bill of Rights doesn't protect groups, tribes, and villages. It protects individuals against the group powers, including the powers of government. The architecture works because the masculine principle was embedded at one point in every institution, courts, where adversarial confrontation revealed the truth, legislatures, where principled debates, not who has big hair or ugly hair or whatever, produced compromise, schools, where competition, something boys excel at, elevated excellence, and families where fathers are the best model of accountability. When the masculine principle retreats from all of these institutions, the architecture falls apart. Now, the multicultural challenge presented in our culture. Here's what nobody is willing to say. America is about to face a test it has never faced before. We've been a multiracial culture for centuries. That's just fact. But multiracial is entirely different than multicultural. Multiracial means people with different appearances sharing the same civic values. Black Americans, white Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans. For generations, they shared the same social contract, individual rights, rule of law, equal justice. They debated applications of those principles. They agreed on the principles themselves. Multiculturalism is different. Multiculturalism doesn't mean having a lot of different restaurants. That's just about being hungry and about satisfying a need. Multiculturalism is not about restaurants. Multiculturalism is about competing value systems. Competing value systems. The competing values, however, must learn to coexist in the same society. Different concepts of justice, different views of individual versus collective rights, different understanding of what the law is for. When multicultural conflict arises, somebody's values must yield. And here's the feminine principle and what it cannot do. It cannot impose a resolution. It cannot say, this is the principle and we will enforce it, even if some of the groups are unhappy about it. Remember, the masculine and the feminine represent energy, not gender. They have masculine, feminine ultimately have nothing to do with gender, sex, sexual expression, or frankly, the reality of your chromosomes. Again, Lincoln versus Douglas, Churchill versus Chamberlain. How do you deal with German expansionism? Churchill, you confront it. Chamberlain, you compromise with it. Jesus versus Pilate. Each of these pairings, they all involve males. They all involve men, but they absolutely represent the conflict between the masculine principle and the feminine principle. The first person in each example stands for the principle of confrontation, not accommodation or compromise. Same chromosomes, different energy, and different results. The masculine principle says this will not stand. The feminine principle says let's find a way to live together. The feminine principle seeks consensus. So, what happens when consensus is impossible? What happens when competing groups are irreconcilable in their demands? Here's what history shows us. When the masculine principle retreats and the feminine principle dominates, individual rights yield to tribal considerations. The pattern is predictable everywhere, and it's as follows. First, the assertion of a collective grievance. Our group has been harmed. Our group deserves accommodation. Second, the erosion of individual due process. Standards of evidence must weaken. Accusation can become proof. The accused must demonstrate their innocence, reversing the presumption of innocence. Third, the creation of protected classes. Some groups receive procedural accommodations and procedural advantages. Others receive procedural burdens. Equality before the law becomes equity, not equality. That is, outcomes are adjusted. The game is rigged based upon group membership. Fourth, the punishment of dissent. Disagreement becomes harm. Principled opposition becomes violence. The masculine willingness to fight for principle becomes toxic. We're watching this pattern unfold right now in universities and corporations and family courts, all courts, in the public square, and throughout social media. We now have an entirely different social contract. What has emerged is not the American social contract. It's a different contract entirely. Remember, the old contract said you're an individual with rights. The state exists to protect your rights. The state cannot infringe on your individual rights. You're accountable for your actions and only your actions. You may succeed or you may fail based on your own merit. The new contract says you're a member of a group now. Your group status determines your treatment. The collective's harmony takes precedence over your individual claims. Dissent from the collective is itself harm. This is not a conservative versus liberal issue. This is a civilizational architectural issue. The masculine principle built institutions that protect individuals from collectivist power. The feminine principle builds institutions that protect collectives from individual disruption, confrontational, change, speech, meaningful, artistic, and creative expression. Both the masculine and feminine have value, but America was designed for the masculine principle. Our culture is out of whack and increasingly illegitimate. The masculine principle has retreated. Thus, the architecture designed for individual liberty has become an architecture for collectivist control. The question isn't whether this shift is happening, it's already here. The question is, what do we do about it? And how we convince more men to re-engage the system and refuse to retreat in the dark night of collectivist enslavement, enabled through compromise and consensus, both being the hallmark of feminine principle, compromise and consensus. So we've established what's happening at the civilizational level. Now let's bring it back to where it hits the hardest, and that is the family. Every statistic regarding the family traces back, all the statistics actually trace back to the family. Men walking away, not in anger, but in arithmetic, when the math doesn't work, rational creature that is men. And when the investment produces no return, we withdraw from marriage. Marriage rates are the lowest in 150 years. Men calculate the risk and the reward, and the family court system tells them what they're worth, only 35% of their children's time. Law students, 56% of law students are women. Family lawyers, the Law Dragon 500, or I don't know, Lizard Mine 500, which about leading family lawyers, 56% of family lawyers are female, according to Law Dragon or Lizard Mind. At any rate, state court judges, one source reports that 49.7% of all judges are already female, but state Supreme Courts, 17 to 18 of those courts are now female majority at the state Supreme Court level. Look, the trajectory is clear. The legal profession is feminine, from training through the practice through adjudication. Family law is gynocentric. That is, it favors the advancement of women to the exclusion of opportunities for boys and men. Hence the feminization of legal institutions. Who decides a dad's fate? Let's look at the pipeline. Again, 56% of law students are female. Women have outnumbered men in law schools, though, for 8 consecutive years. The gap is growing, up 13 percentage points since 2016. It'll be 60% soon, and then 65%, and so forth. Law professors, women are now the majority of law school faculty. They're training the next generation of lawyers and judges, just like the women teachers are training the boys at the primary and secondary school level, and that's not working out well for the boys. Family law, again, remember Law Dragon, Lizard Mind 500, the most recognized guide to leading family law attorneys. 56% are female. Point is, family law is female law, really. Family law is the most feminized legal specialty in America. State court judges, Supreme Court judges, 80% of female mental health professionals, women. 89% of the elementary school teachers, women. The guardian ad litem, the custody evaluated, the therapist, the social worker, overwhelmingly feminized. This isn't complaint, it's problematic architecture. When a father enters the family court system, he enters a system designed, staffed, and adjudicated by people who, on average, are oriented toward the feminine principle. On average, oriented toward the feminine principle. Consensus over confrontation. What do you mean? What do you mean, sir, fighting for your children? Relationship preservation over principled confrontation. Collective harmony over individual rights. Now, clearly, I get it. There are women who embody the masculine principle. They believe in confrontation, individual rights, and principled contest. Um, there are men who embody the feminine principle, and we've talked about some of them. But think about any United States senator, except one. There's one that doesn't embody. You can think you're on your own, but they all embody the feminine principle. They all prioritize consensus and collective harmony over principle. But when 80% of the decision makers in a system share that common orientation, and that system clearly doesn't serve half the population it serves, well, the system is broken. The system reflects the mess up in the architecture. The question isn't whether individual judges are fair anymore. Many are, I got it. The question is whether the system itself is both fair and legitimate. Ask, what are its assumptions? What are its procedures now? What are its defaults? Do they still reflect the masculine principle architecture of individual rights and due process of the law? Or has everything shifted toward the feminine principle architecture of collectivist management and relational outcomes? A father facing the system isn't really facing bias. The father's facing a philosophy now, the philosophy that says collective, the mother, the child, the family stability takes precedence, harmony, avoiding conflict. Preserving the primary attachment, that matters most, and more so than the rights of equal participation by the dad. His insistence on principled confrontation, on asserting his rights, well, that in itself is evidence of instability. He's not losing because a judge is corrupt. He's losing because the entire architecture is shifted beneath his feet and, frankly, is increasingly illegitimate. For every advancement, for every woman in our culture, a man has been pushed back. The inevitable result of that bias is what we have today. Men, boys, men, and dads losing and failing. Men are also withdrawing from education, we're withdrawing from the workplace, withdrawing from civic life. Men vote at lower rates. We volunteer at lower rates, engage at lower rates. Men aren't failing. They're giving up on the system, making our exit. Again, gender never dictates the expression of the masculine principle or the feminine principle. But do notice on social media, the men who post very often about political issues, overwhelmingly, what they're talking about is control, asserting control, asserting control, asserting control over outcomes, not the mission and not the advancement of the culture. Sorry, guys, but it just might be time for you to hand in your man card. At any rate, the civilizational stakes. Here's what I want you to consider. This isn't just about individual men, it's about what happens when half the population disengages. The culture doesn't collapse in flames, it collapses in silence. When men stop building, when men stop showing up, when boys stop trying, the institutions that depend on masculine energy, and by the way, ordered, controlled masculine energy, because we trust the system, you see? The institutions that depend on the masculine energy, provision, protection, structure, they hollow out and they fall apart. You don't notice it at first, but suddenly nothing's working anymore. The family stakes. Every statistic that I've cited goes back to the family. And so let's talk about what we as a family, the human family, can do about all of this. How about a call to action? Last week I talked about male unity and support from our allies. This week I want to give you something specific. Four battle cries, four areas where where your voice matters the most. Teach the boys. Teach the boys. Teaching is dominated by women. Between 80 to 89% as we've talked about, of teachers are female. Most of the law professors are female. The stats don't lie. They don't teach boys anymore. They don't teach anymore. Men don't advance in the system anymore. That's why men are not the majority in graduate school. That's why men are not the majority in law school. Men are no longer advanced by the system, controlled by women. But the system, likewise, doesn't even understand boys and men. You see, that's why almost most of the graduates are female, most at every level. American education is as gynocentric as American law. It favors girls and women and the advancement of girls and women to the exclusion of equal opportunity for boys and men. So it's got to be the theme and the dads who push the theme that only we apparently are capable of understanding what's going on. And I suppose some of our allies who may have grown up with brothers or a strong dad or have sons themselves who understand that men are not from a foreign land. We're not aliens. We are half the population. But men have to lead that effort. We have to demand boy-centered literacy programs. The dual programs for boys and girls are geared toward girls, not boys. We have to demand reading instruction tailored to how boys actually learn. Again, not how children learn. Children means girls, all right? It doesn't mean boys. We have to also support the red shirting option of boys because we mature later. And of course, once we mature, we are unstoppable. At any rate, next, we must demand aggressive male teacher recruitment. 89% of elementary teachers female. Boys need male role models in the classrooms. Rethink also the discipline policies. That will happen if we put more men into the schools. Women teachers are not being taught, let's be honest. Women teachers are not being taught to teach boys, and they understandably, therefore, fail to teach boys. Demand that educational bureaucrats distinguish normal male behavior from pathology. Stop medicating the boys. Reform ADHD diagnostic routines. I should say stop medicating the boys for being boys. If having boys in a classroom keeps any teacher from doing her job, the boys still have a fundamental right. Do you understand? It is a fundamental right to an education, even for boys, not a fringe, not a minimal element of society, but for the boys. Do you understand? The XY chromosome carriers, they have a right to an education, and yes, it is fundamental. We must accommodate the boys who are boys and stop accommodating the teachers. Second call to action, second thing to remember, we have to have full employment for men. I'm glad we have Uber. I'm glad we have Lyft. I'm glad we have all that. I really am. Um, but we need full employment for men. We have to recognize that AI displacement will devastate more men more than it will women initially. We have to acknowledge that male employment isn't laziness. It's about policy failures. There are too many male politicians who embody the feminine principle. Men selling out men. Men who seek to advance their career by compromise. They compromise with the tribes and the angry mobs, loud mobs, and we all know what those mobs look like. And they ultimately diminish the opportunity for boys, men, and dads, and they also lead to the destruction of our culture. That's just the truth. So we need next equal custody for dads. That is a statutory presumption of 50-50. No, 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 not first, third, and fifth. Get over that. 50-50. I don't care if it's first, third. I don't care if it's 2-2-3, week on, week off. I don't know. But presumption must be 50-50. And if the judge wants to have a fuss with overpaid, overfed lawyers, that's fine. They can still bill. But after they get through the presumption that it's going to be 50-50. What it looks like, the judges, the lawyers, those creative people who bill too much, based on, their IQ levels, they can fuss about that in the fight. But we start with 50-50 parenting time. We adjust for those specific consequences. We also call out the bigotry and bias of the Duluth model for domestic violence. Next, yes, men do have reproductive rights. It's expressed through fatherhood. We can't abandon the men. We can't reduce the men, the dads, to visitors. We have a right to equal parenting. We also must take individual actions among ourselves. We have to educate ourselves, engage one another. We have to speak up for one another. Eventually, we've got to learn to vote like a dad. That does mean voting like a man, of course. School boards, judges, state legislatures. Start fathers groups, create content, support organizations doing the work. In closing, thank you so much for joining me today. But remember, nobody's coming to rescue America's boys, men, and dads. That's okay. We'll save ourselves. We've always done that. We're the ones in the trenches. We're the ones in the foxholes. We rush into burning buildings to save one of our own, and we don't blame the person we save. Unlike the fire chief of Los Angeles, we just save them. The schools are burning, the courts are burning, our institutions are burning. Everything's illegitimate. And we've got to rush in and make some changes. We have to fight the lies and we have to fight the cultural hysteria that claims that lies are truth. Keep this vision in mind, a culture where boys receive an education designed for how boys actually learn, where fathers are presumed equal, where masculine energy is channeled through building rather than dismissed as toxic. That's a balanced future, and the only future where we protect freedom, we retain individuality, and we assure creativity. That's our mission. We're not trying to dominate, we're trying to stabilize, we're trying to build and create again. You came here for facts. I hope I gave them to you. Now, do with them what you will, but please follow me for more content on these issues. If you're so inclined, please subscribe to Boat's Law on YouTube. I'll repost this there later today. Share it with a son or a brother or a dad or an ally who's a mom or a sister who needs to know that we're not alone. Share this with everyone. This talk will be reposted, and I say to everyone, God bless you, everyone, my friends. Seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly. Know that this movement needs your voice. Tell your story, tell our story. When we lift up the sons we once were, we build a better world for everyone. Let's unite, let's build, let's go. Next week's topic: why aren't gains for women producing better outcomes for everybody? I hope you join me. Thank you so much for being here. That's the end of this TikTok live. See you again soon, my friends. Well, how's that? Not too bad. Thank you for joining me here. Like and subscribe. Culture's out of whack. It is illegitimate. I mean, let's be honest. We don't have the American social contract anymore. Bait and switch. I got it. I don't know if it happened, with the assassination of one president or one person or whatever, but it's like the frog who slowly boils. We don't have the American social contract anymore. I'm just a lawyer, a podunk lawyer, um, who loves practicing law, and I give thanks to God for the blessing to do so. But come on, this stuff is obvious and no one's talking about it, and it is exemplified in every court, everywhere. And so that's why your viewing matters to me. Thank you, my brothers and sisters. God bless everybody.